Cherry Mine Disaster. On November 13, 1909, the St. Paul Coal Company mine in Cherry, Illinois, began a regular Saturday shift. Nearly 500 men went underground that morning. Many were immigrants from Italy, Greece, and Eastern Europe. Boys as young as 13 also worked in the mine, serving as trappers and mule drivers. The mine was lit with kerosene lamps attached to the wooden timbers. Mule-drawn cars carried coal through the tunnels, and the air was thick with coal dust. For the first few hours, everything appeared routine. Around midday, a car loaded with hay for the mules was stopped under one of the open lamps. The hay began to smolder and then burst into flames. The fire spread quickly to the wooden supports, and smoke poured into the galleries. Miners rushed to put it out with shovels of dirt and buckets of water, but the blaze was already out of control. Attempts at rescue began immediately. Groups of miners and volunteers repeatedly went down into the tunnels, pulling men out through the smoke. Each time, fewer came back. Many rescuers were overcome by fumes and never returned. Panic spread as men struggled to reach the lifts. Some made it to the surface, but hundreds were trapped underground. By the end of the day, the scale of the disaster was clear. Families waited outside the mine for news, but the lists of survivors were short. In total, 259 men and boys were killed. The town of Cherry was devastated, with many families losing one of their loved ones. More than 500 children were left without fathers. 8 days later, on November 21st, there was an unexpected development. A group of 21 men was found alive deep in the mine. They had survived by barricading themselves in a chamber, rationing food and water, and waiting in the dark while the fire burned. The Cherry Mine fire became one of the worst mining disasters in American history. It drew national attention to the dangers faced by coal miners and led to new safety laws, including requirements for firefighting equipment underground and restrictions on child labor. Courrières Mine Disaster. On the morning of March 10, 1906, thousands of men went underground to work at the Courrières coal mine in northern France. The mine was one of the largest in Europe, stretching for miles beneath the Pas-de-Calais region. That day, more than 1,800 miners entered the shafts as part of their normal shift. Many were young boys, some no older than 13. Shortly after 7 a.m., a massive explosion ripped through the tunnels. It was likely caused by a buildup of coal dust ignited by a flame. The blast traveled quickly, knocking down supports and sending fire and toxic gases through the galleries. On the surface, smoke poured from the shafts as rescuers scrambled to understand what had happened. Attempts to reach the trapped miners began immediately, but the conditions were deadly. Thick fumes filled the passages, and smaller explosions followed. Rescue workers risked their lives to go down, but many were forced back by fire and lack of oxygen. Families gathered at the pit heads, waiting for news. In the days that followed, bodies were brought to the surface one after another. The death toll rose into the hundreds. In total, 1,099 men and boys died, making it the worst mining disaster in European history. Then, in an astonishing twist, there were survivors. 20 days after the explosion, on March 30th, 13 men emerged from deep underground. They had wandered through collapsed tunnels, surviving on scraps of food and stagnant water. Their return shocked France and gave rise to the legend of the Rescapés de Courrières, the survivors of Courrières. Public anger grew as evidence showed the company had ignored safety warnings before the explosion. The tragedy sparked strikes and protests across France, with miners demanding better conditions and accountability. It became a defining moment in the history of French labor as unions gained strength and pushed for reforms. Knox Mine Disaster. On January 22, 1959, the River Slope mine near Pittston, Pennsylvania, began its shift like any other. Around 80 men were working underground, extracting coal from seams that lay dangerously close to the bed of the Susquehanna River. For years, warnings had been raised that the company was mining too close to the river bottom. That morning, the danger became reality. At about 11:30 a.m., miners heard a sudden roar. Water began rushing into the tunnels. Above ground, people watched in shock as the Susquehanna formed a massive whirlpool. Ice, debris, and even entire trees were pulled into the riverbed as the water poured into the mine. The collapse created a hole nearly 150 feet wide. Underground, the men scrambled for their lives. Escape routes were limited, and water rose quickly. Some miners managed to reach ladders leading to higher galleries. Others followed makeshift paths, guided only by memory and the dim glow of their lamps. As the flood spread, groups of men tried to stay ahead of the water, climbing into old air shafts and scaling wooden beams. On the surface, frantic rescue efforts began. Mine officials lowered ropes and makeshift ladders down ventilation shafts. Men covered in mud and half-frozen emerged one by one. In total, 69 miners escaped through these desperate routes, but not everyone made it out. 12 men were trapped deep in the flooded sections and drowned. Their bodies were never recovered as the tunnels remained filled with water. For weeks, pumps tried to drain the mine, but the damage was permanent. The River Slope mine, along with much of the Wyoming Valley coal industry, was effectively finished. Investigations revealed that the Knox Coal Company had ignored regulations and allowed mining just 35 feet below the riverbed, far less than the required safety distance of 50 feet. Several company officials and union leaders were indicted, but most served little time. Sunshine Mine Disaster. On May 2, 1972, more than 170 men were working inside the Sunshine Silver Mine near Kellogg, Idaho. The Sunshine was one of the richest silver producers in the United States, and its tunnels stretched for miles beneath the Bitterroot Mountains. That morning began like any other, with miners descending into shafts that reached more than a mile underground. Shortly before noon, smoke was reported in one of the deeper levels. A fire had broken out, most likely ignited by polyurethane materials in a timbered section. Within minutes, toxic carbon monoxide spread through the mine's ventilation system. Miners quickly realized the danger. Many tried to reach the surface through escape shafts and ladders, but the smoke thickened, visibility dropped, and men became disoriented in the maze of tunnels. Breathing equipment was limited, and those without masks collapsed quickly from the gas. Rescue teams entered, but even they struggled to advance in the poisoned air. By the end of the day, dozens of miners were missing. Above ground, families gathered in Kellogg, waiting for news. The search stretched into the night and the following days. As bodies were recovered, it became clear how deadly the fire had been. 91 men lost their lives, most succumbing to carbon monoxide poisoning. Yet amid the tragedy, there was one remarkable story of survival. Two miners, Ron Flory and Tom Wilkinson, had managed to find a pocket of clean air in a remote section of the mine. They sealed themselves in and rationed what little water they had. For 7 days, they remained trapped in darkness, hoping someone would reach them. Rescuers finally heard faint tapping from behind a wall. Drilling crews broke through, and on May 9th, Flory and Wilkinson were brought to the surface alive. Their rescue was hailed across the country as a rare moment of hope in a disaster otherwise defined by loss. Knockshinnoch Mine Disaster. On September 7, 1950, miners at the Knockshinnoch Castle Colliery in Ayrshire, Scotland, began their evening shift as usual. Around 135 men went underground that night, working in seams beneath a landscape of peat and slurry. The mine was considered difficult, but had operated for years without a major incident. At around 7 p.m., disaster struck. A section of peat bog above the mine collapsed into the workings, sending thousands of tons of mud and liquid peat flooding into the tunnels. The slurry moved like quicksand, blocking galleries and cutting off the main roadways to the surface. In an instant, the miners were trapped more than 1,000 feet below ground. Rescue operations began immediately. On the surface, officials realized that traditional routes into the mine were unusable. Any attempt to dig directly down risked triggering more collapses. Engineers instead looked to abandoned old workings that connected to Knockshinnoch. If rescuers could break through, they might reach the trapped men. For 3 days, the miners waited in darkness. Food and water ran short, and the threat of poisonous gas from the slurry increased. Communication with the surface was minimal, but rescuers pressed forward. Wearing oxygen masks, they crawled through old, unstable passages, slowly clearing a path. On September 10th, rescuers finally broke through. One by one, the trapped miners were led out through the abandoned workings, crawling for hours in cramped, airless tunnels. In total, 116 men were saved. Exhausted and dirty, they emerged to cheers from families and townspeople who had been waiting anxiously for days. Not everyone survived. 13 miners were killed in the initial collapse, their bodies buried under tons of mud. Despite that loss, the rescue of more than 100 men was hailed across Britain as a miracle. Sago Mine Disaster. On January 2, 2006, the first workday of the new year, 13 miners reported for duty at the Sago Mine in Upshur County, West Virginia. The mine, operated by International Coal Group, had a history of safety violations, but remained in operation. That morning, the men entered the shaft at around 6:26 a.m. At 6:30 a.m., an explosion shook the mine. It was so powerful that residents living miles away felt the tremor. The blast filled the galleries with carbon monoxide and coal dust. On the surface, smoke and debris signaled immediately that something had gone terribly wrong. One miner, Randall McCloy, was thrown clear of the affected section and survived. The other 12 were trapped more than 2 miles inside. Rescue teams tried to enter quickly, but were slowed by toxic gases and unstable conditions. Progress was painfully slow, with rescuers stopping repeatedly to test air quality and shore up passages. As hours turned into days, families gathered at the Sago Baptist Church near the site. Television crews broadcast the vigil live, turning the small town into the center of national attention. For nearly 2 days, there was little official information. Then, on the night of January 3rd, word spread that 12 miners had been found alive. Bells rang at the church, families celebrated, and the story ran across the world. But 3 hours later, the truth emerged. Only one miner, Randall McCloy, had survived. The other 12 had died of carbon monoxide poisoning, trapped in the dark with limited oxygen. The miscommunication came from a garbled relay of information from rescuers to officials. When the correction was delivered, joy turned to devastation. The final death toll was 12. McCloy, the lone survivor, was hospitalized for months and later wrote about the ordeal. Investigations revealed that the explosion was most likely triggered by a spark igniting methane gas and that the mine's safety systems were inadequate. The disaster reignited debates about mine safety in the United States and led to new federal regulations on emergency air supplies and tracking systems for miners. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe for similar ones and feel free to drop suggestions for the next video in the comments.